Hi, I'm Jadi and welcome back to LPIC series. We are speaking about installing a bootloader. I know for the third time maybe, but this is LPIC, and to be honest, I believe this is the last part of the LPIC1, which is how computer boots, what is UEFI, what is BIOS, what is hard disk, more conceptual concepts. From the next session, it's more hands-on, although we'll have some hands-on here too. And in my opinion, this is one of the things that you should know very well, because sometimes you end up with a Linux which is not booting. Technically, it is booting to some stages in parts of it bootloader. Bootloader loads, but your GNU Linux is not booting. So if you don't know this, you will start with a system which you are not even able to enter any commands, check anything. So pay attention and understand this well. It will help you a lot in your advanced Linux life. And I'm going to show you much more than what LPIC suggests. The reason is I want you to be able to recover broken Linuxes. Objectives are providing alternative boot locations and backup boot options for the third time. Install and configure a bootloader such as Grub Legacy and Grub interact with the bootloader. You should know about menu list, Grub CFG and Grub conf. Grub install and Grub make config and MBR for the third time. I know. You know about boot overview. I will be super fast. On the BIOS systems, you do a post. So it will check the RAM, disk, whatever it wants to do. And then it will hand over the boot process to the first sector of the master boot record, MBR. First sector of the master boot record. It is cylinder 0, track 0, side or head 0, sector 1 of the first disk. The point is this MBR section on your disk is only 512 bytes. It's very small. Old bootloaders like LILO used to be able to stay here for their whole life and size. These were small. But later, we had a new bootloader. It was called Grub. Grub was much bigger, so we call them smart bootloaders or multi-stage bootloaders. Part of Grub lives here. This part is loaded via BIOS with the process I told you. And this small part, less than half a kilobyte, exactly half a kilobyte Grub, loads the next part of the Grub, which resists in some other parts of the disk. Lives on another part of the disk. This way, you can have larger than 512 bytes bootloaders. Okay, so you should know about MBR and this kind of smart or multi-part bootloader. On UEFI systems, you have UEFI stages. When the system comes up, at the first security phase starts. Security phase checks that this operating system, is it safe? Can I let, by I mean my hardware, can the hardware, as the UEFI hardware, let this operating system boot your computer? These phases run one by one, and at the end, it finds one FAT32 partition. It's a old school Windows partition or DOS partition, file allocation table. And there should be a PE executable file. Your UEFI goes through different stages. On each phase it tests something. At the end it finds one FAT32 partition and execute one PE executable there. When we say PE executable, it's a Windows compatible executable file. But at the end, in both cases, in UEFI and in BIOS, what happens is a binary starts running. This binary is called bootloader. This bootloader can find Linux kernels and equivalent or related init RAM FS and boot them, or they can do something which is called chain loading. Chain loading is giving the control to the next bootloader. So for example, if you have a hard disk on the MBR, you have GRUB, and your GRUB can go to this partition and boot your Linux, and you have one Windows here, GRUB doesn't need to know how Windows boots. Windows has its own bootloader installed here. So it's enough to tell to GRUB that my first boot option is this partition with this kernel and this init RAM FS. My next option is chain loading to this partition. If you tell this to the GRUB, GRUB will just give the control to this bootloader and resigns. Anyway, we have two different GRUBs. As I told you, in old times we had something which was called LILO. LILO was very small, very difficult to configure, and very, very, very limited. So most of the distributions switched to the GRUB, which was a 1999 project. In 2005, so only after 6 years, they said, okay, we had our tests on GRUB version 1, which we called Grub Legacy. And we are going to rewrite everything in GRUB version 2. Nowadays, practically all distros are using GRUB version 2. But you should know about GRUB version 1. So let's have a look. Trivia. We never technically had GRUB version 1. They were very modest, and at the moment it might be GRUB, I don't know, 98, 0.98. So they never claim that we reached version 1. They always say, we are still working, we are changing things. So they switched to GRUB 2 before going to GRUB 1. But this is called GRUB 1, close enough, or GRUB Legacy. Sorry, because it was very bad handwriting. Anyway, GRUB is a grand unified bootloader. In the first part, I will continue with GRUB Legacy. On the next video, I will go to GRUB 2. We will see, for example, Ubuntu system running on GRUB 2. We will interact with it, with change configurations. But on GRUB Legacy, I will just tell you the information from the book, which you can find on linuxfirst.com. GRUB version 1, or technically GRUB 9 point something, I think 9.8 is the latest one, is installed in /boot grub. Its main configuration file is boot grub menu list. But nowadays, especially based on Red Hat, most distros are calling this file /boot grub grubconf and link it to this one. This is because all the system admins, especially after GRUB 2, are familiar with /boot grub grub configuration. So they created this file and link it to this one to make things easier. Menu list or grubconf have two different sections. In the first sections, you have some general configurations. What color I should use, which menu should be the default, how much should I wait before selecting the default ones, and this kind of stuff. On the second part, you have some different boot options. For example, you say, I want to boot Ubuntu from this disk, from this. I want to boot Fedora from here with this kernel, with this RAM FS. If not, I want to have an option to start Windows with chain loading from this partition. So two different parts. On the first part, you have these configurations. For example, you have color. You can say color, red, white, blue, white. This means all the lines should be red foreground on white background. The selected line should be blue on white. So if you go up and down and select one menu entry, the selected one will be this one. Default tells you which boot menu item is default. If you say default 0, means select the first boot menu if user didn't do anything in blah blah time. If this fails, go to fallback. So in my configuration, I can have default 0, fallback 2. And later on the second part of the file, I can have different boot options. I will show you how. They are separated by title, blah, 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 title configurations, title configurations. So after timeout 10, after 10 seconds, it will boot from the 0, from this one. If this fails, it will go to the fallback is 2. So it will go to this one, 0, 1, 2. Anyway, you have the hidden menu, do not show the menu. Splash image, fancy for those years. You can have a splash image as a background, so it would be much fancier. You have some timeout, you can have a password, MD5 hashed password, and you can save default, still fancy for those years. If something is chosen as the boot, next time choose the same thing. This was the first part, general configurations like color, default, and timeout. On the second section, you have repetitions of these. Title, so I can say title, Fedora. Show a menu item called Fedora. Root tells the grub which hard disk should be used. That can be HD00. So this will be the first partition of the first hard disk. You remember, on the Linux, this will be dev SDA1. Here it's 1, here it's 0. This is ugly. On the grub 2, this is solved, and the first partition is called 1. So you will have root, which partition I'm going to use for booting the system, which kernel on that partition, which init RD on that partition. So this is one combination. Or you can say title, Windows, no root verify, do not verify that this is a correct partition to booting or whatever, because I want to do a chain loader +1, go to the next chain. So just go to this drive and continue, from this root. Let me show you. I'm speaking confusing, I know. And this is difficult. You will see experienced system admins who are not easy with these things. This is a sample Grub 1 or Grub Legacy. It tells you, okay, comment. My default is 1. So if nothing happens, you should boot this. Timeout is 10 seconds. Wait 10 seconds before booting this. If on the first hard disk, 5th partition, you remember how this works. If it's a BIOS, so you can create only 4 partitions. But one of them can be a extended partition. So on this extended, which is 4, you can create 5, 6, 7, whatever. But because we are speaking on a Grub Legacy and it starts from 0, so this will be 0, 1, 2, 3 will be the virtual one, 4, 5. So you are starting from 6th partition if you count from 1. On the 6th partition, go to the boot directory, go to the grub directory, and there is a photo which is zipped here, gzipped here. Show that as your background to be fancy. And I have a password. Then I have my first boot option. So if this is the grub page, it will tell you upgrade to Fedora. Upgrade to Fedora, because that's the title. And then it says, if this is run, load this kernel. This boot, this blah blah, or this RAM disk. But the default one is 1. So if I do nothing, this will be used. The title will be Fedora. It will go to HD0 fifth partition, counting from 0. On that partition, go to the directory boot and find this file as your kernel. Load it read-only, and when the kernel is loaded, use this a partition with the label Fedora 8 as your root file system. Do it with color and don't make much noise, and this is your init RT. As you can see, it happens here again. It says, okay, another older version of Fedora I have on the same disk. So you can, if this kernel doesn't work with your hardware, you still have the option to boot from an older version. And always, if you, sorry, no always. If you, I mean still always, I just forget it. If you select the kernel and select the init RD, this combination will boot your hardware. But when the kernel is up, it should use some disk as its root partition and mount it as root. So you have to tell it, a partition with the label Fedora 8 is my root. Or you can say /dev SDA3 use this as your root partition or whatever. Or you can use UUID, which is a unique ID of a partition. You have a grub menu. If you choose grub menu, you will go back to this grub because it chain loads the HD01 with a chain loader. You can boot from your Windows because it goes to HD00, uses the first partition and does a chain loader. So we'll hand over the control to this bootloader. Easy, you see? And there are not many commands you should know about. When you have the grub and you have configured it, you have to install it on your disk. So you can do grub install on dev SDA, not SDA1. Normally you install on the whole disk. So it will go to MBR and do its magic to put part of the MBR and load the rest from somewhere else. Here, because this is super old, in my example, I have it installed on a floppy disk. Very cool. And I believe that's it. You can interact with Grub Legacy. So when it's booting, you can push up arrow, down arrow, go to the next one, or you can push C to enter a command line mode, and you can type your commands. We will see in the next section when you are happy, or you can push E to edit any menu, and when you are happy you can do F10 to boot it. We will see all of these, or Control X. And when you are in a C, you have to define one kernel, one init RD and root, and type boot to system to boot, or press escape to go back. I will show you this on the next part when I'm speaking about grub2 and we will interact it, which is kind of same. Stay with me. What you've learned is obsolete, not totally. If you are a good system admin in a huge company, you may see grub1, but most systems work with grub2, which is kind of same. Be with me.